Welcome everyone to today's Massey Dialogue, which is being held in conjunction with the Democracy Exchange 2020, which is the annual summit for Canada's democracy sector. And the context for our discussion today is the growing threat to democratic freedoms, norms, voices, and institutions around the world, and the rise of authoritarian populism and assertive authoritarian states. As many of you know, Freedom House has declared that democracy is in retreat and reported 13 consecutive years of democracy setbacks around the world. And even our neighbor to the south has been demoted by the Economist Intelligence Unit to a flawed democracy. So there are obvious implications for our own democracy, and the Democracy Exchange Summit and Festival have catalyzed an important conversation in this country on these issues. Today, however, we're going to focus on Canada's stake in strengthening democracy norms and institutions outside our borders. We're going to ask whether democracy promotion should become a more central pillar of Canadian foreign policy. This is not a new idea. Successive Canadian governments and parliamentary committees task forces have championed democracy promotion. However, Canada is yet to mount a major foreign policy thrust in this area. Today, we're going to hear from three of Canada's top experts in the field of democracy support: a leading scholar, a leading practitioner, and a leading writer and thinker and advocate on these issues. So let me introduce our panel to you. First, Jennifer Welsh is the Canada 150 Research Chair in Global Governance and Security, and also the Director of the Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill University. And Professor Welsh is a leading scholar internationally on humanitarian action, conflict, migration, and the responsibility to protect, as well, of course, of Canadian foreign policy. And a special note here, maybe for Massey College, is that Jennifer delivered the 2016 CBC Massey Lectures on the Return of History. So Jennifer is joining us from Montreal. Grant Kippen is currently the Chief Electoral Advisor for UNAMA, which is the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. Grant has over 35 years of experience working in democracy promotion, democracy strengthening, and he's worked in many of the hot spots of the world: Kosovo, Somalia, Yemen, and Ukraine, of course, now Afghanistan. And Grant is joining us. Thank you very much, Grant. He's joining us in his evening from Kabul. And our third panelist, Tom Axworthy, is the Chair of Public Policy at Massey College. And Tom has a distinguished career in multiple realms: government, academia, philanthropy, and probably more than anyone else in Canada, Tom has advanced the case for why and how Canada should promote democracy in the world. Tom is joining us from Toronto. So the format for today's session will be 2 rounds of short interventions from our panelists, and then we're going to open it up for questions from all of you who are joining us here today. We will use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're probably all used to it now. We will take your questions and play them out to the audience and to the panel. And we're going to touch on 3 sets of issues. We're going to talk about how democratic norms around the world are under threat and what this means for Canada and Canadians, and how and whether Canada should advance its democracy promotion efforts. So I'm going to start, if I may now, with Jennifer. We're going to go Jennifer, then Grant, and Tom. So Jennifer, please welcome to Massey Dialogue.
Thank you, and thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I would like to just start by talking about 2 global trends as a backdrop for this discussion. One I'll just speak about very, very briefly, and the other in a bit more detail. The first is, of course, the power transition or the power shift that we are seeing globally with the rise in power of Asia, and particularly China, and the relative decline of the West, and most notably the United States. And we know from history that power transitions are periods of instability. They don't necessarily lead to conflict, but they are periods of instability. And what that also means in the current context is that we are witnessing the capacity of China as a state that is asserting its power to exercise a level of influence, if you will, in institutions and in diplomacy that are commensurate with its growing power. And we can say more about that, I guess, in Q&A. The second trend that I wanted to spend more time on is the retreat of democracy globally. Margaret mentioned the Freedom House report and the declines in civil and political rights around the world. I think the downward trend in levels of freedom is particularly worrying because it's no longer concentrated among autocracies and dictatorships, but has also infected countries of every regime type, including those traditionally rated free by Freedom House. So countries that were not long ago praised for making democratic transitions, such as Hungary, the Philippines, Poland, and Turkey, are backsliding into forms of illiberal and in some cases authoritarian rule. And the onset of COVID-19 has reinforced, but also expanded in some cases the global anti-democratic trend, as some leaders have exploited the crisis to imprison journalists and opponents, to crack down on protest, and to heighten surveillance of their populations. And so all of these developments challenge the reigning assumption of the late 20th century, which was that the slow diffusion of democracy to all parts of the globe was just a matter of time, economic prosperity, and a gentle nudge. At the same time, institutions that have democracy clauses, such as NATO or the European Union, have been very reluctant to criticize those rollbacks of civil and political rights, leaving authoritarianism unchecked. Mm-hmm. And in many respects, this is because established democracies are absorbed by their own political challenges. The long-term consequences of the financial crisis has fostered disillusionment in many Western countries about what democracy can deliver. As well, we have seen the appeal and strength of populist movements. So political scientists are now identifying a prospect that seemed unthinkable in 1989, a process of democratic deconsolidation in which citizens of prosperous and mature democracies become positively disposed to alternative political systems and alternative political values. And of course, within this broader context, the historic role of the United States as a beacon of democracy has been tarnished by its historic levels of income inequality, its highly polarized politics, its institutional deadlock, and worrying instances of what one scholar, Nancy Bermeo, has called executive aggrandizement. So what does all this mean for Canada specifically? Well, I wanted to point out three potential risks for us. The first is simply social and political instability in some of our key democratic allies. I think we simply need to point south of the border, but we can also look to some of Canada's traditional transatlantic allies to see that they are grappling with quite troubling sources of instability and political risk. And we certainly need to be watching the US election in particular, which is coming up, for the possibility of uncertainty and instability following that election. Secondly, in terms of a risk, we're seeing more assertive autocratic states. Our geography and the nature of our relationship with the US has meant that Canada has long been protected from the prospect of conquest or occupation. But today we face concrete threats to our values and political institutions from more assertive autocratic states. And then the third risk I'd point to is the unraveling of democratic peace and cooperation. The growing confidence of authoritarian states is also driven by the ever-growing sense that alternative political models might have a fighting chance of knocking democracy off its perch from its preeminent position. And I think that is important for us to consider as well as a risk to Canada. Foreign policy experts in this country disagree as to how vigorously Canada should promote democracy internationally in the face of these challenges. But many would accept that a world with fewer democracies would be one less hospitable to the advance not only of Canadian values, but also of Canadian interests. So let me just close by identifying very quickly the 4 strategic challenges that these trends, I think, pose for Canada. Firstly, with respect to China in particular, our choice is whether or how we want to take a tougher stance towards China. Today, we face the reality that China is both a necessary partner, but also a concrete adversary and opponent to some of our goals. Our second strategic challenge is how pluralist we want to be in our foreign policy. Do we want to be muted in our criticism of democratic backsliding because of the need to work with a variety of states or not? Do we want to continue to be a strong voice? Thirdly, how do we want to redefine what it means to work with the like-minded? We have a very traditional sense of what the like-minded is. It tends to be confined to the transatlantic space. But if we are thinking about acting in a more concerted way with other democracies, that remit needs to be expanded to include important liberal democratic states in other parts of the world. And I would identify here Japan and South Korea as being among those. And then finally, as a strategic choice, how much weight and how much by way of resources do we actually want to dedicate to democracy support through our development assistance and our mechanisms for political assistance in our foreign policy? We've long said that democracy is part of our foreign policy, but how do we want to reinvigorate that agenda in this current environment of democracy retreat? And so I'll stop there, Margaret. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Jennifer. Grant, we're going to turn to you in Kabul then, on the ground, if I can ask you to speak now, please.
Great. Thank you very much, Margaret. And I'd like to begin by thanking Massey College and DemocracyXChange for inviting me to participate. I just pick up on some of the things that Jennifer was saying. I think there have been many useful and informed conversations for some time, but unfortunately there hasn't been a lot of substantial progress on carving out not just a distinctive, but as Jennifer mentioned, a resourced international development, democratic development strategy, which I think personally has been a missed opportunity. And given the space of time that's gone on in that discussion timeline, to me, the question is, if not now, then when? And so I think we need to be looking forward and looking at what's happened in the past. My personal opinion, and I think as Canadians, and again, Jennifer touched on this, is that I think we have, we're in a bit of in a unique geographical position. We only have one neighbor. We're separated by oceans on 3 sides. So I think in some respects, this lulls us into a false sense of security, or we take perhaps longer than we perhaps should in making decisions around very important issues like this. I think we tend to, as a country, tend to overthink things too much. We spend an inordinate amount of time in study and reflection before taking decisions. But I think we need to step up and step up now. But if we look at leaving it aside for a moment where we are, I think we need to look at where the rest of the world is. And I don't think we recognize perhaps the situation that many other countries live in, and which is a much different situation than where we are right now. And it's changed dramatically, as Jennifer has said, not just because of COVID, but over the last 15 years, even before that. I think we have to look at the world through their eyes, those countries, those organizations, governments around the world that see Canada for what we have created here, a multicultural based society, economically prosperous, socially progressive, inclusive, tolerant. I get asked time and time again, why isn't Canada here? What can Canada do to help us? And I think the point that I'd like to make is that I believe there's a huge pent-up demand for Canada's role in building a strong and inclusive societies around the world. And it's about telling our story about how we got to where we are today. And it's not about forcing our way of thinking. It's about sharing our collective experiences and the story that we've created over time. And I don't think we should be shy from telling that story. And it's something that, I mean, our position in the world, I think we have a responsibility to tell the story and to foster greater relationships with countries in many different ways. I think Jennifer also alluded to this. I think there are a lot of benefits to taking a more progressive stance in this area. And one is the potential economic benefits from trading with other countries, the political stability that comes with stronger social and economic ties. The trend these days is isolation, but it won't always be this way. And I think that's why we need to look at where we need to think of the future. We need to think about where we as a country want to be in the coming years. And I will go back and I'll use my Canadian heritage by quoting from Wayne Gretzky, who was once asked what made him one of the most prolific goal scorers in the NHL. And his answer was, I don't go to where the puck is, but to where the puck will be. So I think the need to take a more active international democracy promotion role for the country is looking ahead to where things need to be in the future. And so not just protecting ourselves, but also contributing to the stability in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Grant. So Tom, over to you, please.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to try to build on some of the remarks that Jennifer and Grant have made and put it into really a context with three essential points. So the first is, and both Jennifer and Grant had mentioned this, that democratic values and human rights have really been a centerpiece of the Canadian value system, and we've tried to express that internationally. That right from the start, for example, when NATO was created, it was Mr. Pearson who insisted on Article 2, which was about a free association of nations combined to work toward those values in the very contentious, difficult world that they were in 1948 and 49. So right throughout the peace, the last 50 years, Canada has taught and lived and built in our own country a thriving democracy. Now, it behooves us all to be modest when we talk about our accomplishments, but when we look at democratic attainment, the creation, the working of federalism, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the fact that we have independent election commissioners, that we have very little corruption in our elections, virtually on every dimension of democratic attainment, this country has done very well. We're not the only ones. The Nordics have been very good and so on, but particularly in comparison when we see what is happening in the United States and voter suppression and so on, Canada has put in place institutions for a long time that have worked on those issues. So we have generations of experience, as well as our 200-odd year history, to think through how institutions can work and how parties can work to make democracy work better. So it is a Canadian source of expertise. One reason that Canadians like Grant, but many others, have been sought out by the various organizations who work on democracy promotion and human rights. They are chock-a-block full of Canadians working in this field, but not working for an agency which is part of our foreign policy. They're part of somebody else's foreign policy. But they're very skilled people, and they are much in demand. When some of us worked on a panel report for Mr. Harper's government in 2009 on the idea of democracy promotion, at that point, there were about 300 Canadians employed at that time in various ways for democracy promotion and human rights. And that's a decade ago. So how many more have been working in that area? So there are a lot of Canadians with a lot of expertise in areas that need it. Secondly, this fact has been recognized. That is, we can go back to Pearson in 49 on Article 2 as a general statement, but more specifically in our examinations within Canada, as you said right in the introduction, Margaret, parliamentary committees and many voices in Canada have advocated for a much larger attention to democratic issues around the globe. We have had a 2007 report of the Standing Committee on Foreign Policy called for a specific democracy promotion agency. As I said, Mr. Harper's government then created a panel, of which I was on, to look on how that idea could be implemented. The 2009 fiscal crisis hit, and for a variety of reasons, Mr. Harper's government didn't implement the recommendations of that report. But then again, this past summer, or a year from ago, 2019, a parliamentary committee again looked at the same subject and said, what has changed since we recommended this in 2007? And their conclusion was that, as Jennifer said, the situation has only gotten worse. People need Canada more, if not now, when, and recommended it again. So we've had two parliamentary committees with a lot of work on this, recommending a specific agency. And the Trudeau government responded by putting the idea in their platform and in the speech from the throne. But then we've had COVID, of course, has hit, and so many files have been put aside, at least initially, because of the threat of the crisis. Now, in our just mentioning Massey for a moment, Margaret, you were part of it, and other scholars and activists were part of it. We began working again pre-COVID to try to flesh out what such an agency could do as a new instrument in our Canadian foreign policy. And that's why I'm so delighted that Massey has gone back to this public forum to return to this idea that has been much discussed. And the last single thing I will say is why a particular agency in this perilous time. That's because the independence of a dedicated agency gives you a lot more flexibility on the ground. It's very complicated, difficult being an ambassador. Jennifer has talked about states themselves being worried about working with governments and putting on a mute button when it comes to democracy advocacy. But an independent agency, separate from our ambassador, has more freedom. It can speak to opposition leaders. It can work with NGOs. I'm not putting down our ambassadors and the global affairs and the good work that it tries to do, but there is a lot more efficacy in a dedicated group who can work on this full time and have the flexibility to work with a society which would welcome that help. So we're calling for, with all the background that I've described, we need a dedicated instrument which is working on this, and we certainly have the Canadian men and women willing to join it and work on it, so they'll be working for Canadian values abroad rather than the foreign agencies they're working for now.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tom. Before I go back to the panel for just another round, I just encourage those who are who are tuning into this and who are with us today to pose their questions or maybe comments, but questions into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I've got a couple already. That would be great. So I'm just going to go back and maybe we could just get responses from the three of you again to what you've heard from your colleagues, but maybe start, Jennifer, with the question that I think Tom left us with, which is like, why hasn't it happened up till now? You in your comments, you talked about how most foreign policy advocates maybe disagree about whether or how much priority should be placed on democracy support in Canadian foreign policy. But nobody disagrees that the world is becoming a more hostile to Canada's democratic interests and values. So the question is, even though all three of you have made the case for why and why now and why Canada, there also seems to be hesitation or reasons why we haven't been able to move forward. So I just wondered if we could talk a little bit about what are the conditions here that need to be put in place to actually get where we haven't gotten to before. So anyways, that's one question, Jennifer, but back to you for a few more minutes of comments, if you may.
Yeah, thanks so much for these comments by Grant and Tom. I'll just make 2 points. I think, one of the reasons for the hesitation relates to some of the lessons that were drawn appropriately or inappropriately from efforts taken in the 90s and 2000s. So there is a sense in which democracy promotion in the muscular style of the George W. Bush administration is an approach that was misplaced. It was about completely destabilizing societies and expecting out of that destruction would come something creative. And so I think there's a sense in which, what we tried to do in the past didn't work. That's one reason. And I think perhaps inappropriate lessons were drawn from very high profile cases. And also the difficulty of measuring through tools like development assistance, how best to use these kinds of instruments to bring about democratic change. I remember being involved in a book project just over 10 years ago on how we use development assistance for good governance, and actually just trying to find data that would show you which efforts went to which kinds of programs and how do we measure effectiveness was so difficult. And so there's a tendency to want to throw up your hands and say, well, it's very hard work to do. It's hard to measure. Is it strategically wise to engage in it? But I would just make one plea in terms of how we think about this. I would be leery about conceiving of this as democracy support, which feels very democracy promotion, which feels very one way. I think we're now in an era where this is about mutual support for democratic consolidation, where Canada, where France, where the United States, where the Netherlands are in it just as much as newly established democracies. So how do we support one another in the growth of our own democracies? And I think that framework of democracy support is, in my mind, a better framework. And then within that, for Canada, where do we choose strategically to focus? Do we, for example, take those countries that are in the midst of very delicate democratic transitions or in the process of potentially backsliding? And do we focus our efforts there? On Ethiopia, on Armenia, for example, on countries where, it isn't all a bad story. We have some signs of success. I think it's also about being strategic where we choose to operate in the current environment.
Thanks, Jennifer. Grant, what do you think?
Thank you. No, I'm all on board with what Jennifer was laying out in terms of the strategic priorities. I particularly like the way she expressed the mutual support, not just with existing democracies, but also with those that are, either in a post-conflict or transitioning state. I would also say that to Jennifer's point about democracy promotion, I think we need to think about this in a much larger space, not just looking at, say, political parties or election commissions or work with civil society, but I think to the point that's been made both by Tom and by Jennifer about building institutions. And I think, to me, a strong democracy is about delivering services to the people. And so I don't think that's just necessarily the domain of political parties or civil society. I think, how do we work with other countries in developing more effective governance structures? So I think there's a lot to learn, not just at a federal level, but we have a lot of examples at the provincial level, at the municipal level, that, I'm thinking of the country where I'm sitting right now, could use a lot of support, particularly at the lower levels, and demonstrating how the government is reaching out and assisting its citizens. So I think we need to look much more broadly in the democracy development strengthening space. I think we also need to look at who, Jennifer mentioned Japan and South Korea. I think Tom mentioned the Nordics. I mean, this is, or perhaps you did, Margaret, that I think this is we need to look at where our allies are, our partners are, and then look at what we can bring to the table in strengthening what they're doing. And, we're just not going to start off in a sort of a shotgun approach. We're going to be everywhere. But we need to start off some small wins and then build from there. But I think there's a tremendous potential here, and something that I think we have perhaps a global responsibility to step up to. Thank you.
Great, Grant. Thank you. Tom.
Well, I think you have to, obviously the 2020 context is different than the 27 or even 2 or 3 years ago. So on the first point which has been made, which is that democracies in many places are under peril. And that's true. And that means that we have to work with others who also feel that same need. Now, to take a case in point, we have had Russia and China being very aggressive in the use of social media, cyber warfare, to try to subvert democracies everywhere. Now, that is a case where there can be a very strong coalition of ourselves, the Europeans and others, to try to work on the question of cybersecurity in elections. There's a general agreement that we're all under threat through the use of these new tools, and how can we best defend it, and how can we do that together? So right at the start, there's a democratic coalition building that could take place around that clear area. Looking at differing allies doing differing things, that always has been part of our vision of how we could do more on democracy. We can't do it all, and we in Canada have got particular strengths in particular areas. Not that many people, know how to run a federation. It's very complicated. Few people have had more experience than ourselves in how to do that. So putting together coalitions of like-minded states who have projects in which we could take a piece and the Nordics could take a piece, areas that also, which had formerly looked at the United States as a leader, that's in grave doubt. Certainly in the Trump administration has been anti-democratic in its impulse. So areas where there is now a huge gap, where Americans had once played it and haven't in the last few years. We don't know what will occur in a week or two's time. But in areas like Latin America, which is in our own hemisphere, and we can play a role there. And in particular, also getting back to one of the main points that Jennifer made initially, there are parts of the world, there are Africa, Latin America, and others, where China has been a huge influence on the ground there. They've filled the gap in many ways of the decline in American leadership. Ourselves with other like-minded nations could at least perhaps provide a counterintuitive in those parts of the world if we can get that kind of coalition building going.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks to the three of you. We've got some questions coming in from our colleagues in the audience. And I'm just going to read them out to you and then give you a chance to, I'll just take maybe I'll take the first two. And we'll recognize some of the names from Jerry Schmidt, who's also done a lot of work in this area. Jerry, I'm glad you're with us today.
Yeah.
His question, well, as he said, there have been years of proposals to advance Canadian support for democratic development, and the case has been made. What will it take for this government to act? And then a second question, if I can, from Stéphane Courtemanche. Back to a point that you made, Jennifer, how is the pandemic enhancing threats to democracy, especially for women and marginalized groups? And why and how should Canada ensure democracy assistance is integrated into COVID-19 responses and recovery efforts? And Tom, I don't know if that's from Stéphane or is from Tom from the Parliamentary Center. So maybe we'll just take those two questions off the top. If I'll start again with Jennifer.
Thank you. When we think about, I'll take the second one perhaps. When we think about the pandemic, there's been such a tendency to rush to conclusions about what impact it's having. And I think there's been different phases. And our job, in this panel is to think about them less in relation to public health, although there's a link between public health and democracy, but more specifically in terms of the health of our political systems. Initially, in the first couple of months, I think what the pandemic did is remind many, if they needed reminding, of the importance of national governments in delivering responses, in protecting their citizens. And of course, we saw different levels of capability to do that, but citizens were looking to their governments to deliver. And as I was mentioning in my opening remarks, one of the findings of political scientists over the last 5 or 8 years is that it is not necessarily the case, which some might believe, that there's been a serious decline in democratic values, in attractiveness to democratic values. In some places that's been the case, but it's a more minor part of the problem. The bigger problem is dissatisfaction with what democracies are delivering, which is it's a different thing. And so in a sense, the COVID episode brings into sharp relief again the degree to which governments can deliver timely solutions. And what's been fascinating to me as we've seen the response to the pandemic is that we initially had a judgment that, well, authoritarian states will do better at this than democracies. They're able to rally people together, they're able to impose solutions. And very quickly, it's become obvious that it isn't about regime type. We've seen authoritarian states do well, do badly. We've seen democratic states do well, do badly. Germany is a country that, at least from where we sit now, has been able to find that sweet spot between having a certain degree of decentralization, which has allowed it to be responsive, but yet with coordination. And we've had great variation. So I do think we still need to see, as this pandemic unfolds, what the links to democracy strengthening and weakening really are. But it's certainly clear that the connection to surveillance and the temptation to want to control populations, depress dissent, has been something that has been more marked since the pandemic since the pandemic started. And that is indeed very concerning.
Great. Grant, I know you had some connection. If you're there, Grant, and then Tom, any responses to those first two questions? Grant.
I thought Jennifer handled the second one brilliantly, and I've got nothing else to add on that. To Jerry, good question. I don't know what it's going to take for the current government in Ottawa to act on this. I think, like a lot of things, it comes down to political will and whether this is a priority of the government. And the case has been stated, I think, several times during this discussion that right now, I mean, governments around the world, because of the pandemic, are having more and more difficulty, in the fiscal space, and the ability to fund initiatives is extremely difficult, in order to meet domestic requirements. So, I'd like to think that this would be top of the priority list, but I think, being realistic, I think it's going to it'd be nice to see some start made, but I'm not at this point in time optimistic about that there will be a big start anytime soon. Thank you.
Well, I'm a little more optimistic than Grant for these reasons. That when we look at the state of Canadian foreign policy right now, so many of the assumptions, as Jennifer has talked about, are crumbling. So I think also within our government as well, that we have had, I think it was a shock to many that we didn't succeed in winning a seat in the Security Council. Everyone knows that our China policy has to be rethought, root and branch. There are two Canadians being imprisoned illegally over there. We know how active Russia has been on the cyber files. So these are our fertile grounds for new thinking about where we position Canada. And in the area of positioning us to really, again, I do want to be modest, but there are few countries which have as many successful elements of an operating federation as ourselves. This could be a role in alliance with several others that could really give us a chance to talk seriously to all kinds of folks who perhaps haven't been too interested in what Canada has been saying in the last few years. We can work with Latin Americans on their issues there, in Africa, which has not had much focus. We can help Asian countries, which are looking at the huge behemoth of China, active locally, as well as through the Belt and Road, and say there are some alternate ways of doing this. In a time when our foreign policy has shown to be wanting in some areas, and driven home in very dramatic fashion, this is an excellent time then to say there's an area where we have capability, expertise, a tremendous need around the world, and perhaps we can help fill it in this area, as Mr. Pearson did so brilliantly in peacekeeping.
Hey, thanks, Tom, and everybody. I have a question here from another person who's been active in this area, Owen Lippert. His basic question, I believe, is how to keep intact, or how to generate all party support for a Canadian democracy support effort agency. And just in his commentary, he says, what role might Canada play in taking a stand for the rights of the loyal opposition? Not any particular opposition party, but the concept of opposition and contestation. He refers to Professor Susan Hyde, has, in his view, correctly pointed out that the government capture of democracy promotion has crowded out civil society and opposition parties. So this is you know, it's always, this is actually an interesting aspect of the issue. Anybody on the panel would like to jump in on that question?
Grant, have you in your own democracy work over the years, have you worked with legislatures or with others around the role of oppositions?
No, I haven't worked in the political, in the parliamentary space. I think Owen, the two individuals that could probably speak best to this aren't on the panel, and that's Owen and Tom Cormier, who've been working in this space for the same organization in different countries on this. And but you know, in terms of the work that I've done in the past, it's been very clear we work in a nonpartisan way with all the parties. So it's not, we're not choosing one over another. So that was a very a deliberate take or policy stance, the organization that I was working for at that particular point in time. But, you know, you know, and again, this is a tricky issue, you know, particularly if it's, but, you know, maybe one way of looking at this is what the Stiftungen do in Germany. I mean, the party foundations there typically line up on, you know, on depending on the particular philosophy of parties in the countries that they operate in. So it's, that's one approach that you could look at. But you know, again, if this is going to be an entity that's going to be funded by the government, public funding, then I think, you know, there would need to be some sort of rules of the road on how you apply that. How you know what your rules of procedure or operating principles are going to be going forward.
Well, one of the just very quickly on this, Margaret, that in the days at Queen's at the Center for Democracy, when it did a lot of work abroad, one of its major projects was on democratic values, curriculum and teaching in Ukraine, and to the police colleges, to the public services colleges, and so on. And on Owen's point, one of the key messages is that in a democracy, everybody loses most of the time. I mean, you have to compromise, and you have to be prepared that it isn't a zero-sum game for you. So Owen is exactly right that the concept of democracy also revolves around accountability and the rights of opposition and a plurality of ideas, and that this should be welcoming rather than threatening. And so that is also a very good area to work on, and some of our groups have done exactly that. The Canadian Parliamentary Centre for one too.
If I could just jump in,
go ahead.
Briefly.
Go ahead, Grant, and then we'll just have Jennifer in.
Sure. You know, the point I made earlier, you know, I think we have to looking at it in a very broad sense about who we're going to potentially work with. I mean, one of the examples that I'd like to point out in the recent, in the 2018 and 2019 elections here in Afghanistan was the work that the Afghan security forces played in supporting the elections themselves, not just operationally, logistically, but there was a lot of training that went on through Resolute support and with the relevant ministries in developing a training program for those security personnel that were protecting the polling stations. So they had been accused in the past of interfering in the process, but this training really gave them you know, a sense of what the do's and the don'ts were. So I think you know, we have to look at the sort of the whole, take a holistic view on the different aspects of the process and try to look at what kind of interventions we can make to support the process as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Jennifer, you wanted to jump in.
I do think that, you know, I'm less well versed on what it would take to create all party support, but if I take the bigger question of parties wanting to respond to what they think Canadians' concerns are, you know, I do think in the area particularly of the use of development assistance for the support of democracy, there is an accountability question. Back to Canadians, it's going to be important for any of these political parties. And I think the challenge there I've been spending some time over the last few weeks looking at the amount of money that's being lent to countries to deal with COVID. You know, is the elephant in the room, which is in some countries corruption, and the degree to which it has counteracted many of the effects of the resources that we have provided. And I think it is legitimate for Canadians to ask questions about, you know, some of the countries that we have given large amounts of assistance to have not made the kinds of gains, you know, high-level gains we would have liked. You know, the most recent example of this is Lebanon. So we have to be prepared to both measure and communicate the effects of our efforts in a way that can illustrate to Canadians that this kind of work has a positive impact. To not let high-profile instances of, you know, state failure take away from being able to show where impact is real. But it's a huge challenge, and I think that if we can't get at that, generating all party support at that very basic level, which is to say we're addressing Canadians' legitimate concerns about whether this kind of thing works, then it's going to be an uphill battle.
Okay, I'm just going to just a question that came in actually on the chat line. It goes back to something that you said, one of you said earlier, I think maybe Jennifer, which asks whether or not, you know, whether Canada is a credible advocate or promoter of democracy and supporter of democracy. The question is, given how much power, you know, the executive branch of the government has gathered to itself in Canada, and the reduction in independent parliamentary oversight, you know, as stated by this person, Akash Maharaji, how credible is Canada amongst other developed democracies as an advocate and a promoter of democracy abroad? Anybody want to take that question on?
Well, Grant, you said in your experience, people are asking you continually, can Canada get involved? Do you want to tell us the views of us on the ground, at least on the ground in Afghanistan or Yemen or the other places you've worked?
Well, I'll tell you a story that hits home in your hometown of Winnipeg, Tom. In 2005, I was the chairman of the Electoral Complaints Commission, and we had, this was the first time it was established, and so we were doing training for, I think it was about 300 people that were going to be sent across the country to help adjudicate complaints. And so I gave some welcoming and introductory remarks, and we got to through the first training session. And we had a tea break, and there was a gentleman came up to me, and he said, "Hi, I'm from Winnipeg." And I said, "Oh, okay." I said, you know, he was an Afghan Canadian. And I said, "So what are you doing here?" And he said, "Well, you know, I've been all over the world, as you know, I've been to Europe as a refugee, and finally the family got an opportunity to come to Canada, and we settled in Winnipeg." And he said, "I never felt more home in Winnipeg than anywhere else in the world." He said, I can go anywhere in Winnipeg and see the world." And he talked about Folklorama and buying a passport and visiting all the different pavilions.
Right.
And he said, "The reason I came back here is because I want Afghanistan to be more like Canada, more like Winnipeg." And so, as I said earlier, I mean, there's rarely a place I go that there's not a Canadian connection and a stated desire to learn more about Canada and what makes us tick, what worked well, and start, as I said earlier, that story, that discussion, and learn more. And I think it was Jennifer that made the point. It's not about, you know, telling them what to do. It's engaging in that exchange and learning from each other and becoming stronger through that. So yeah, I'd say, you know, the question is, how do we organize ourselves, how it's resourced, and how we meet that need, specific need and requirement. But I think there's an untapped demand that's out there that we haven't met, and we could.
one of the points, Margaret, for the audience to understand is that when we have volunteers who work abroad, they come from all the parties. And what has impressed me most is that whatever differences we have had on local issues or how Parliament was operating, when you go abroad, those what unites the Canadians speaking to the seminars and the training sessions is far greater than the differences among us around party support. Whether the people from whatever party they come from, the general support around the rule of law, how Parliament operates, and the role of parties is overwhelming, and there's a genuine multi-partisan consensus among people who have worked abroad from their experience on Canadian parties that this should be a good thing. More of it should happen, and it should be organized more efficiently and more up front. But there's a genuine coming together once we get outside of Parliament Hill.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Tom. I'm going to let the panel here have a final round just to wrap it up, because we're 4 minutes left in our session. We did have a couple more questions that came in. We won't be able to get to all of them, but one coming from Tom Cormier, just talking about the point that you were just making, both of you, I think, about the role of parliamentarians themselves, legislators, and acting in how this is a non-partisan enterprise to build democracy and democratic norms, and so that he was just asking about that question about involving parliamentarians in political party strengthening.
Absolutely.
So, but I'm going to just go back and maybe Jennifer, back to you quickly. Jennifer, Grant, and Tom, any final words from you about, well, I guess really, what next? What would be your final piece of advice or to the audience or to policymakers?
I do think that it is incredibly important for us to be self-critical and recognize, in contrast to some of the hubris of the early post-Cold War period, that models are completely transportable. This is, as I mentioned at the beginning, much more of a common discussion among those who like the democratic system about how it can be strengthened and consolidated in a world in which there are many pressures on all democratic states. And part of this also has to do with cultivating through our education systems a renewed commitment to democracy. And that is, again, a project that's, travels the world. It's not just in Canada where that's necessary. So collective thinking on that, I think, is extremely important. But I also think that given we are in the post-pandemic space and resources are very, very scarce, if you look at what has been donated or dedicated in terms of resources to national COVID response, rather than international, the national dwarfs the international. And there will be pressures within Canada to make tough choices. And so therefore, if we are going to engage in democracy support, we're going to have to choose where we focus geographically and in terms of the types of issues on which we want to develop expertise.
Great, thank you. Grant, final word?
I go back to the point I made earlier, if not now, when. And to me, the sooner the better. And I think it's extremely important. And the time couldn't be more important just to engage internationally where we are today. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Grant. Tom.
Well, I would reach out we have a parliament of minorities now. We have a need for a really basic rethink of Canadian foreign policy, how it can be more effective and attuned to our values and working with the new difficult world that Jennifer described. Within that mix, I think we've got talent around democracy and the institutions to help make democracies work better in a variety of areas. It's never been needed more. So the next steps should be that those working in the areas, NGOs, Canadians, and parliamentarians should return to that report. And there should be a lot of intensive work on to learn what didn't work in the past, as Jennifer talked about, but what has worked, where we need it more, and to develop a blueprint for the kind of agency that 2 parliamentary special committees or standing committees have called for. And while the government is preoccupied with COVID and a host of other issues, we should be working hard, getting as much brains and expertise from former parliamentarians and others around the country. Let's develop a blueprint and send it how Canada can make a contribution to democracy and human rights, because as Grant said, it's never been needed more.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for wrapping it up. A call to action there. That was terrific. A huge thank you to Jennifer, to Grant and Cabell, to Tom for a really excellent panel on a topic, as you've all said, that's more important than ever. I'm going to close down now this Massey dialogue and thanking you and thanking our participants, and just do a little pivot to the Massey dialogue that's going to happen next Wednesday at 4 p.m. October the 28th. Actually, we're a perfect setup. What do they call that? Setting, first act for next week, when Bob Ray, our new ambassador, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, is going to be on with Steve Paikin and Catherine White from the United Nations Association, talking about Canada on the global scale. We'll make sure that Bob and the others watch this video and get this issue into their little earworms before they go live next Wednesday. So that's the next Wednesday for the next Massey dialogue on October the 28th. And thank you all very much. And huge thank you to our participants and our panelists for joining us today.